Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a land where the wind never stops howling. The nights stretch endlessly, and even the sheep look like they've seen something they shouldn't have. Welcome to medieval Iceland, where the ground trembles with buried stories, and some of those stories refuse to stay dead. You're about to learn why this frigid, lava-scarred island became a place where people wrote ghost stories, not just for fun, but for survival, and they wrote them in books made from cowhide. Yes, actual cowhide. This isn't your average haunted house tour. This is cold, bleak, bone-deep spookiness with just a splash of sheep dung. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it? I love seeing our little global map light up. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside a turf-roofed farmhouse, the kind that's half buried into the land to keep warm in winter. Your boots sink into the frost-crusted mud. The wind cuts sideways into your cheeks. And overhead, the northern lights twitch like the sky's trying to send a signal no one understands. It's the 1200s. You're in Iceland. There's no Wi-Fi, but there is a ghost in the cowshed. The landscape here is both brutally empty and unsettlingly alive. Glaciers loom, volcanoes grumble, and the long winter nights feel like they've forgotten how to end. It's no surprise the supernatural crept into the minds of the people who lived here. When half the year is darkness and the other half is barely brighter, you start to imagine things in the corner of your vision. And in Iceland, they often imagined the dead weren't quite done with the living. This wasn't a place of bustling cities and crowded churches. It was scattered farms connected by narrow paths and shared stories. When someone said they saw a ghost, people didn't shrug it off. They added it to the mental map of the landscape, right alongside fjords and lava fields. Ghosts became part of Icelandic geography, and those stories, they weren't just scary campfire tales. They got written down on expensive, painstakingly prepared cowhide. Vellum manuscripts were precious, often reserved for Law's family sagas or scripture. But somehow in this harsh corner of the medieval world space was made for tales of hauntings, undead shepherds, and restless farmwives who refused to stay buried. Historians still argue whether this obsession with ghost stories was a reflection of deep spiritual belief or a cultural coping mechanism for a brutal existence. Maybe both. But what we know for certain is that Icelanders told and preserved these stories with fierce dedication. One reason: the ghosts in these tales weren't just spooky. They were active participants in the community. They stomped on rooftops, killed livestock, haunted family gatherings, and spread disease. The dead weren't just metaphors. They were problems to be solved. Picture this. It's the dead of winter, literally. You're huddled in a smoky longhouse with your family, the walls lined with turf and animal skins. The wind moans outside, but inside the fire crackles, and someone begins to tell a story. Not just any story, a saga. And not just a saga one where the dead return, eyes glowing, dragging their shadows behind them like wolves. This is entertainment, yes, but it's also instruction. These tales tell you who's dangerous, what kind of behavior invites disaster, and who's remembered long after death for all the wrong reasons. Some ghosts are angry because they weren't buried properly. Others come back for revenge. Still others were just jerks in life and kept the streak going after death. Each one is vivid, personal, and terrifying. There's no safe distance from them, no guarantee they won't come to your farm next. And when these stories finally make it into ink, scratched in deliberate strokes onto cowhide pages, they become more than memory. They become legacy. That's what makes Iceland unique. So few people, so many ghosts, and yet they kept the receipts. It wasn't just oral storytelling around the hearth. It became a written tradition, one that survives to this day in beautifully preserved manuscripts with names like Erbygja Saga and Grettir's Saga. Epic tales filled not just with heroic deeds and blood feuds, but full-on paranormal horror. Grettir, for example, doesn't just fight bandits. He fights a draugr, a vengeful walking corpse who guards treasure in a burial mound. Kind of like a Viking zombie boss fight. And unlike some Christian medieval stories that saw ghosts as lost souls or divine warnings, Icelandic tales often portrayed the dead as purely malevolent. A revenant wasn't trying to deliver a message from heaven. He was trying to bite your face off and maybe flatten your sheep in the process. So yes, Iceland had plenty of ghost stories. But what's wild is that they were preserved like family treasures written in cowhide books that were stored in chests alongside heirlooms and legal documents. And the stories weren't just spooky, they were social. They reinforced norms, warned against betrayal, and sometimes called out people who'd misbehaved so badly they got a starring role in the afterlife as a menace. And that's just the beginning. The cold seeps into your bones as you step back into the farmhouse, not just from the Icelandic winter, but from the creeping sense that stories here aren't only told, they're lived, recorded, and remembered. You settle beside the hearth, the fire popping as if punctuating every sentence in the story your host is about to tell. Tonight, it's a saga, but not about kings or dragon slayers. It's about a man who buried his wife too shallow and what crawled back out to tell him so. These are not stories told lightly. In medieval Iceland, storytelling was as vital as breathing. Before printed books, television, or a reliable postal service or any postal service, really people kept their culture alive through sagas. That word might make you think of sweeping battles and heroes on horseback, and those definitely exist. But the Icelanders had a special branch of sagas reserved for darker tales. Tales of the undead. Tales of the draugr. You've probably heard the term saga, used 100 times, especially when your friend won't shut up about that one really long fantasy series. But in Iceland, the sagas were real local and deeply rooted. They were long prose histories passed down orally, and later written down, some of them, more than 100 years after the events they described. And when they finally did get written, it wasn't on paper. It was on cowhide. Let's pause for a second there. Imagine someone taking the time, effort, and considerable expense to turn cowskin into vellum, then sharpening a quill, preparing ink, and sitting down by the meager light of a whale oil lamp to copy out a ghost story. Why that story? Not a law code, not a bishop's sermon, but a tale about a corpse walker who breaks a man's spine because someone insulted him at a feast. Historians still debate whether this was done for entertainment preservation or something deeper, perhaps, as a form of spiritual anchoring in a world where so little felt secure. Some argue these texts were teaching tools, cautionary tales disguised as thrilling accounts. Others think Icelanders simply had a flair for the dramatic. Given the saga's tone, both might be true. The process of turning stories into manuscripts was selective. Not every tale made it, but a surprising number of ghost stories did. That's what makes Iceland's literary tradition so fascinating, its balance between the sacred and the supernatural. You could open a vellum codex and find the Book of Psalms, and right after that, a saga about a man being strangled by his undead brother-in-law. Picture a scribe hunched over a slab of vellum tongue, poking out in concentration, trying to get the shape of a rune just right, while his neighbor complains about ghost hooves clattering on the roof last night. This wasn't an ivory tower endeavor. It was often personal. And the people writing these stories were part of the same communities experiencing them. Sometimes the scribe was a monk or priest. Other times, he was a farmer who knew his runes and had a strong enough stomach for ink. Many scribes copied stories from older oral traditions, others from texts brought from monasteries. But in Iceland, even with a strong Christian presence, ghost stories were not dismissed as superstition. They were documented like facts because sometimes they felt like facts. Imagine how different that is from the rest of medieval Europe, where church authorities often tried to suppress ghost stories or fold them neatly into Christian morality tales. In Iceland, ghosts got their own page numbers. They were part of the cultural furniture like sheep ashwood staves and passive-aggressive weather. And there's something else: these sagas weren't just copied for others to read. They were performed. A good storyteller could hold a room with nothing but a smirk, a voice, and a well-timed pause. And if you were telling a tale that ended with a ghost pressing its cold hands around a man's throat, you'd better believe you had your audience's full attention. One famous example is etched saga, a sprawling tale that blends family drama with full-blown supernatural mayhem. At one point, a ghost infestation gets so out of control that the local priest has to conduct an exorcism in the middle of a turf field. It's less the power of Christ compels you, and more please stop climbing out of the burial mound and ruining the party. And then there's Grettir's Saga, where our brooding anti-hero battles not just enemies but the undead, most notably a terrifying corpse called Glam. Glam is massive aggressive and has a stare that drives people mad. When Grettir finally defeats him, it's one of the most intense and eerily specific duels in all of medieval literature. No vague metaphors, just real dread. So why write this stuff down? Because people believed it mattered, whether as moral instruction, cultural memory, or simply a good way to pass the long dark hours. These stories were chosen for preservation. They didn't just echo in the rafters, they lived on the page. What you're holding, if you're holding one of these manuscripts, is more than parchment. It's a conversation across centuries, a flicker of firelight in a winter without end, a reminder that someone hundreds of years ago saw something they couldn't explain and decided it was worth remembering. And yes, Icelanders also wrote about family feuds, lawsuits, and the occasional elf. But time and again the dead walk across these pages. Sometimes it's because they weren't buried properly. Sometimes it's because they were wronged. Sometimes it's just because they can. You lean back by the fire, now maybe a little colder than before. Outside, the wind is still whispering. And the sagas. They're just getting started. The wind has picked up again, rattling the wooden shutters of your little longhouse hideaway. It sounds almost like someone pacing outside, doesn't it? Step for step. A little too slow. A little too steady. But of course it's just the wind. Just the wind. You pull the sheepskin blanket tighter, eyes darting toward the door. No one there. Yet. Welcome to the world of Icelandic ghosts. Restless, relentless, and wildly creative in their methods of haunting. You've met ghosts in other cultures, sure. Transparent, maybe a bit weepy, possibly dragging some chains for dramatic effect. But Icelandic ghosts. These are not your standard fare. They don't rattle teacups or whisper regrets. They interact. They move things. They fight. They sometimes sit on your chest until you suffocate. In the sagas, the most feared undead creature is the Draugr, a revenant. Think of it as a corpse that skipped the whole resting in peace part. A Draugr doesn't just appear to deliver a message. It walks. It kills livestock. It poisons food. It climbs onto rooftops and breaks beams. And yes, occasionally it just lies back down in its grave like nothing happened. Casual. Historians still argue whether the Draugr was a holdover from pagan mythology or a Christianized fear of sin made flesh. The truth likely falls somewhere in between. In Etched Saga, a particularly troublesome Draugr brings a plague of undead to a whole district, like a grim supernatural domino effect. One unquiet corpse becomes many, and soon the only way to end it is by digging them up, chopping off their heads, and burning the remains. You know standard property management, but the Draugr isn't the only ghost in town. You also get corpse walkers, boundary breakers, and some very angry shepherds. One classic tale tells of a man named Thorolfur, who after dying got so annoyed with his burial site that he basically haunted the entire area, slaughtering livestock, terrifying locals, and ruining real estate values. They had to move his remains, and twice. And even that didn't help much. And let's not forget the bedguest ghosts. These spirits slip into homes, lie down next to sleeping people, and then just stay. Some start whispering. Others simply exist oppressively. Their presence is heavy, unshakable. In one case, the haunting is so persistent that everyone in the household eventually dies or flees. It's like your least favorite Airbnb guest, but spectral and vengeful. You see, Icelandic ghosts were physical. They had your weight, neat. Some accounts describe them leaving actual footprints in the snow or impressions in bedding. This wasn't metaphor. This was monster of the week material, but rooted always in a very practical concern. What happens when someone who should be quiet doesn't stay quiet? And the answer was often disturbingly legalistic. If a ghost was haunting a place, the community didn't just light candles or call a priest. They could hold a court proceeding. That's right. You could sue a ghost. You'd get witnesses make a case and argue that this particular dead person was ruining lives and violating property rights. If the case succeeded, a priest might perform an exorcism. But often it ended with digging the person up, dismembering the body, and burning it. Not very neighborly, but effective. Imagine telling your insurance agent today, "My barn collapsed because of a draugar," and them responding, "Well, did you obtain a legal decree of haunting first Icelanders in the 13th century?" That was normally. This odd mix of superstition and structure gave ghost stories serious weight. They weren't just for children. They were tied to land ownership, inheritance disputes, and moral behavior. If someone died holding a grudge, they might come back to claim what was theirs. If someone was buried improperly, their body might protest until it got the respect it deserved, and the stories got detailed. We're talking decomposing facial descriptions, putrid breath, glowing eyes, groaning from inside burial mounds, you name it. These were not stylish phantoms with unfinished business. They were rot and rage, memory and muscle. Sometimes the cause of haunting was simple neglect. Other times, it was guilt. One story tells of a man haunted by the ghost of a woman he wronged. She appears in visions, her body blackened and dripping with seawater. He has to publicly confess to end the haunting. A literal guilt trip. On the flip side, if you wronged someone and they died, you'd better start sleeping with one eye open. And if you're thinking these were just spooky yarns to keep children in line, well, yes and no. These stories traveled fast and far, but they were localized. The ghost you feared lived 2 valleys over. The saga didn't just say a ghost appeared. It said a ghost appeared in the region of Snæfellsnes, behind the 4th hill, where the path forks near the rock shaped like a troll. That level of detail made them real, immediate, personal. By the time these stories were written down, they already carried the weight of tradition. Some had been passed down for generations. They weren't just about the supernatural. They were also subtle social weapons. Calling someone's ancestor a draugar, that was a big insult. You were saying their lineage was cursed, restless, shameful. There are even recorded cases of disputes where someone tried to clear their family name by writing their own saga or revising an old one to make sure grandma wasn't remembered as a corpse murderer. See, Icelanders took ghosts very not seriously. And while modern scholars might see these tales as rich literary folklore back then, they were warnings. Play fair. Bury your dead properly. Don't steal your neighbor's sheep, because if you don't, they will come back, and they probably won't knock first. You settle deeper into your blankets now. Outside, the wind has calmed. For the moment. But in Iceland, you never really know what walks behind the weather. You stir in your sleep as the fire pops in the hearth, and the wind shifts again, almost as if someone just opened the front door and stepped inside without announcing themselves. But of course you're alone. Probably. Out in the real medieval Iceland, though someone was always listening. And often, that someone was writing. Not with ballpoint pens or typewriters, but with sharpened quills on carefully stretched vellum, often made from the hide of the same cow that may or may not have heard the ghost in the hayloft. What's remarkable about the Icelandic ghost story tradition isn't just that people told them, But who wrote them down? You'd expect this kind of stuff to be passed around by gossiping grandmothers or nervous shepherds people with time and imagination to spare. But the reality is much stranger. Ghost stories in medieval Iceland were frequently penned by priests, lawmen, chieftains, and even farmers who had a bit of spare ink and too many long dark evenings. That's right. The people recording these tales weren't fringe weirdos. They were respected members of society. Many had legal training. Some had spiritual authority. These weren't people dabbling in idle superstition. They were part of the intellectual class of their time. And they were writing seriously spooky stuff. Take John Halldorson, a bishop, who collected moral tales and incorporated supernatural elements into his writings. Or the Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, which includes detailed sections on how to properly handle burials, lest you end up with a reanimated lawsuit. One clause essentially says, if a body starts showing signs of wandering, you messed something up. Okay, not in those exact words, but you get the idea. Even Book of Settlements. Land Namabak, which is essentially a colonial land registry, sometimes slips into ghost story mode. You're reading about so-and-so staking claim to a fjord, and then suddenly there's a haunted hill, a ghost cow, and 3 unexplained deaths. Like the medieval version of Zillow, but every third listing is slightly cursed. The scribes themselves were often what we'd today call multi-hyphenates. A priest, poet, lawyer, a farmer, scribe, goat keeper. These were people who wore many hats, probably made of wool, and if they had a spare sheepskin and some ink, they didn't waste it. Ghost stories weren't lowbrow. They were woven into legal cases, theological commentary, and moral education. Historians still argue whether these writers believed the ghost stories they wrote, or if they saw them more as teaching tools. But the way they describe events complete with names, places, dates, and outcomes suggests a level of sincerity. They didn't write a ghost showed up. They wrote, in the year of our Lord, 1221, at the farm known as Havamur, the late Thorhildur was seen walking by the sheepfold 3 nights in a row, wearing her burial shroud and muttering about unfinished chores. That level of specificity makes it feel less like folklore and more like a police report. But don't imagine these ghostly scribes as cloistered monks with a flair for the dramatic. Many were writing in turf homes, lit by oil lamps huddled beside a family asleep under one big fur pile. They'd dip their quill and continue scratching out a saga while snow creaked on the roof and some wind-tossed rock clattered against the shutters. Honestly, how could you not write a ghost story in that atmosphere? And the content they chose to preserve wasn't random. These stories served a function, sometimes to shame a rival, sometimes to honor the dead, sometimes to remind readers and listeners that there were consequences to breaking social codes, even from beyond the grave. You insult your neighbor. That's one thing. But insult a dead neighbor, and you might get flattened by their reanimated corpse next harvest season. That's one way to keep everyone polite. Even Icelandic genealogy was haunted. Family sagas often included a ghost or two somewhere in the tree. And if your family line had a particularly memorable haunting that wasn't necessarily shameful, it could become part of your legacy. Something that said, yes, we own this valley, and yes, our great-great-uncle still occasionally rides a headless horse through it. Deal with it. One particularly compelling document is Sturlunga Saga, a saga compilation that includes personal accounts, political conflicts, and of course, ghostly episodes. One story from the 13th century describes a legal assembly where people are debating property law when a ghost shows up. Not in a dream, not in a metaphor, just a straight-up ghost attending court, silent and watching. And no one says, this is impossible. They say this could complicate the testimony. There's a phrase in Icelandic, Draugar þurfa, líka ad borga skatt týr. Even ghosts must pay taxes. It's not real law, but the sentiment reflects how deeply the supernatural was embedded in civic life. These tales were meant to be taken seriously, not just for chills, but for community cohesion. The message was simple: treat the dead with respect, keep your oaths, and always double-check your gravedigger's work. And if you're writing this down, you make sure to include the ghost's name where it walked, what it wore, and what it said. That way, no one could accuse you of embellishing. Because in Iceland, a ghost wasn't a metaphor. It was a neighbor. So next time you picture a medieval manuscript, don't think of monks in towers copying scripture. Think of a weather-worn priest jotting down a saga in the back of a smoky farmhouse, occasionally pausing to say, "Did anyone else hear that outside?" Because stories weren't just stories. They were records, nad. They were proof, kirk. They were the only way to make sense of the shivers running down your spine. The light from the hearth dims, casting long shadows across the walls. You can almost imagine a flicker of movement near the doorway, the kind you dismiss out loud, but track with your peripheral vision. The kind that makes you mutter, "It's probably just the draft," knowing full well there's no breeze indoors. Welcome to another long night in medieval Iceland, where stories weren't just told, they were etched into skin. Literally. Let's talk about vellum. Not velvet. Not parchment in the modern sense. Vellum. Real cowhide. Treated, scraped, stretched, and used as the page on which some of Iceland's most chilling stories were preserved. If you've ever wondered, why would someone write ghost stories on animal skin, you're not alone. But the answer is more practical and a little more poetic than you might think. First, the practical part. Iceland didn't have a lot of resources. No native paper trees. No abundance of linen for pulp. What it had was cows. Or rather cows that sometimes didn't make it through the winter. And when they died peacefully or otherwise, their hides were a precious commodity. Clothes, shoes, ropes. And when treated with care, and a whole lot of elbow grease. Vellum. Preparing vellum was no small feat. You had to soak the hide in lime scrape off every trace of flesh and hair with a crescent-bladed knife, stretch it tightly across a wooden frame, and let it dry under tension. It was physical, time-consuming work. Then you sanded it smooth. Then, maybe you could write on it. You receive. Historians still debate whether Iceland's vellum-making tradition was imported from Europe or developed locally out of necessity. But we know one thing for sure: every page of vellum was valuable. So writing ghost stories on it that wasn't done frivolously, that was a choice. Which brings us to the poetic part. What better material for stories of the dead than the skin of the once living? There's something deeply Icelandic about the idea that memory, legend, and warning could be inscribed on the flesh of an animal that once walked through those same snow-covered fields. It's a strange kind of immortality, and vellum lasted. Many of the Icelandic sagas we read today survive only because they were written on cowhide, which resists moisture and time better than almost any other medieval writing surface. That's why Grettir's saga, Eyrbyggja saga, and Fleti Jarbak still exist tales of ghosts recorded on ghost-touched materials. Let's not forget vellum wasn't just durable, it was symbolic. It turned speech into permanence. And in a land where few people had formal education, and even fewer could write, having a story put to vellum meant it was endorsed, namerkir, validated, embedded in the cultural archive. But not every ghost made it to cowhide. Only the best ones, the scariest, the ones people didn't want to forget either because they were too bone-chilling or too useful. Useful, yes. Ghost stories served as social tools. You could warn about bad behavior, reinforce community rules, or shame a rival by recording a supernatural visitation connected to their family or farmstead. You didn't just whisper, "That place is haunted." You wrote a saga about it, preserved on vellum, forever. One particularly grim tale tells of a woman who died in childbirth and was hastily buried. She came back night after night, wailing through the walls until a priest blessed the grave properly. The moral: don't skimp on burial rites. Another tells of a wealthy man who refused to share food during a famine. When he died, his ghost haunted the pantry, hoarding invisible bread, rattling chains, and cursing the living with hunger. Message received. In a society where formal law was still evolving and centralized power didn't always reach remote valleys, these stories were a kind of moral code, not enforced by kings or bishops, but by fear. You didn't need a sheriff if your village believed in the consequences of disrespecting the dead. And because vellum was so rare, these stories had to earn their place. You don't waste a stretched cowhide on a weak haunting. The ghosts who made it onto vellum were the ones who left bruises, the ones who opened wounds that didn't close, the ones who made whole valleys whisper. Some sagas even include illustrations, rough ink sketches of the revenants' graves or haunted houses. Imagine opening a cowhide book and seeing the face of a ghost staring back at you, crudely drawn, but unmistakably menacing. No printing press, no fan art, just someone centuries ago trying to capture the memory of terror. And speaking of memory, these stories weren't written for casual entertainment. They were written because people believed forgetting was dangerous. Forget the burial ritual, invite the dead. Forget your ancestors' vengeance, he'll remind you. Forget the mistake of letting your cousin's corpse lie unblessed in a shallow grave. Well, that's on you. Cowhide wasn't just about preservation. It was about making sure that certain truths, certain warnings, lasted longer than fire flood or famine. It was Iceland's version of etching something in stone, only warmer, stretchier, and slightly more ominous. And here's the strangest part of all: vellum wasn't just used for one thing. The same codex might include hymns, legal records, and sandwiched somewhere in the middle a ghost story. No big divider, no fiction label, just seamlessly woven into the record of Icelandic life. You're left with this picture: a scribe in winter scraping together ink from soot and fish oil, dipping a quill, and deciding that this story about the dead man who walks into his old house and stares silently at his widow until she flees screaming was worth the hide, worth the time, worth the history. And now, hundreds of years later, you're still reading or hearing that story, that ghost, because someone long ago made the eerie, brilliant choice to trap the dead in cowhide. The fire has burned low now, casting more shadow than warmth. You shift slightly, and the sheepskin crinkles under your weight. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest sound, maybe wind, maybe footsteps, scrapes the edge of your imagination. But you stay still, listening, because this part of the tale, it's when the stories bite back. Not every Icelandic ghost story was written to spook you by candlelight. Some of them were far more pointed, less horror story, more public service announcement. They were cautionary tales, moral road signs, and occasionally thinly veiled insults aimed at local enemies. You could call them supernatural shaming rituals. You see, ghost stories didn't float outside of everyday life. They were tangled right into it. If someone wronged you or your family, it wasn't always safe to confront them directly. Feuds could get bloody fast, so instead you told a story about a greedy farmer who didn't share his food during winter, and now his ghost lingers near the pantry, or about a jealous neighbor who stole from a burial mound and now suffers visits from a screaming spirit every harvest. And if that character just happened to resemble a real person everyone in town disliked, well, that's just coincidence, right? Historians still argue whether these stories were created after the events as a form of moral accounting, or during them as a way to gain power through public perception. What's clear is that once a ghost story was recorded on vellum, it became more than entertainment. It became a weapon. Take Eyrbyggja Saga again, because honestly, it's a greatest hits album for Icelandic hauntings. One section tells of a farm that becomes overrun with the undead. Livestock die. Children fall ill. Everything goes wrong. The source of the haunting, a dead woman named Thorgunna, who wasn't given proper burial rites. But in between the hauntings, the saga drops some suspiciously specific commentary about the character of the family she left behind. Coincidence maybe, but readers at the time would have known exactly who the story was talking about. Iceland was a small society. Think of it as a 1,000-person village spread across glaciers and fjords. If you heard a saga about a haunted farm near the black sand beach, and you happen to live near a black sand beach, you got the message. These stories had consequences. If your ancestor featured in one, you might spend the rest of your life defending your family's honor or distancing yourself from it. Sagas were reputational landmines, but they were also instructive. They taught you what not to do. Don't insult the dead. Don't hoard food. Don't lie to your neighbors. Don't move the grave marker to gain an extra plot of land. Don't bury someone upside down. Yes, really, that happened. And yes, the ghost was furious. In many of these stories, the line between justice and revenge is thin. The dead return, not because they were bad in life, but because someone else was. And the message is loud and clear. The dead will finish what the living started. Some tales go even further, targeting entire families or regions. You'd hear stories about haunted valleys, cursed hillsides, rivers that whispered secrets. If your family was connected to one of those places, good luck. Try selling land when people think your property comes with a free ghost. One story tells of a man who made a fortune through dishonest trade. When he died, he was buried in his best cloak on his own land with an extravagant feast. But the saga says he was seen walking the shoreline at night, dragging a net full of coins that bled seawater. His descendants eventually abandoned the property, claiming the animals wouldn't feed and the weather never felt quite right. These weren't bedtime stories. They were social commentary dressed in spectral clothing, and sometimes they were used to resolve conflict. If a haunting appeared in a saga connected to a legal dispute, it might sway public opinion. Maybe you couldn't prove your neighbor stole your sheep, but if a ghost showed up cursing his barn well, that was comfy evidence, wasn't it? In this way, ghost stories became a kind of folk justice, a way to rebalance the scales when the law failed or wasn't brave enough to do the job. But it wasn't all vendettas and vengeance. Some hauntings served to warn future generations. One tale features a woman who dies in childbirth and whose ghost appears every year at the edge of her property, weeping and singing lullabies. She doesn't harm anyone, but the story is always told with a heavy emphasis on the husband's cruelty and neglect. Moral of the tale: don't treat your wife like livestock, or she might come back with a haunting lullaby. Icelandic ghost stories often present a kind of karma with frostbite. Actions echo long after the actors are gone. The dead speak walk and demand remembrance. And if they can't get justice in the courts, they'll take it in dreams in barns or by standing just out of reach on stormy hillsides. Imagine growing up in a house where a story like that is carved into the walls of your memory. Not told once, but every winter, every feast, every funeral, until it becomes part of who you are, part of what you fear, part of what you know. And remember, these weren't anonymous folk tales. They had names, dates, places. They were lived in. They were passed down not just as warnings, but as community records. So next time you hear a story that makes your skin crawl, ask yourself who benefits. Who's being warned? Who's being remembered? Because in medieval Iceland, a ghost wasn't just something scary. It was something useful. The wind outside has softened, but your heartbeat hasn't. Not after those stories. Not after picturing graves cracking open under frost just to let a grudge escape. But don't worry, we're not done yet. In fact, now we're getting to the part that makes Iceland feel like the world's loneliest haunted house: the isolation. Imagine you live on a farm in 13th century Iceland. Not a village, those were rare. A farm. Maybe one neighbor in sight if the sky is clear and the sheep aren't standing in the way. Your home is made of turf and stone, built low into the landscape to hold warmth. Your windows are little more than slits. In winter, it's dark for, 20 hours a day. In summer, the sun barely sets. Either way, time doesn't feel normal. And neither do your thoughts. This is where Icelandic ghost stories truly thrive. In the silence between sounds, there's a long-held belief that ghost tales bloom in isolation, and nowhere proves that better than medieval Iceland. It's not just about being alone. It's about being alone with your memory. The mind has room to wander, and the dark has space to answer. Historians still debate whether the extreme climate caused more belief in the supernatural, or simply created the perfect conditions for people to imagine the worst. But one thing's certain: when there's nothing else around for days, and the wind won't stop whispering your name, a ghost story isn't just plausible, it's probable. This isn't just poetic speculation. The sagas often describe the settings of their hauntings with claustrophobic precision. Narrow valleys that trap echoes, long snow tunnels leading to lonely burial sites, the sound of breathing heard through turf walls. The ghosts themselves seem to rise from the landscape, as if the earth, tired of holding the dead, simply lets them out. One story describes a man traveling across a lava field in the middle of winter, only to encounter a shadowy figure mimicking his every step at a delay. When he stops, the figure stops. When he moves again, so does it. But he never hears footsteps, just breath, his own or not. Another tells of a woman who saw her dead husband every time she was alone by the hearth, always just sitting across from her eyes, open, unmoving. No message, no anger, just watching, but only when no one else was in the room. And he always disappeared when she blinked. These tales aren't filled with elaborate rituals or heroic battles. They're quiet, patient, built for people who live entire seasons with nothing but firelight snowdrifts and the sound of their own breath. And it's not just the weather. The physical remoteness of many Icelandic settlements made communities almost self-contained realities. There were no new faces, no new gossip, just old stories, old grudges, and old bones buried just barely beneath the surface. In such places, the line between the living and the dead wasn't just thin, it was fuzzy. You didn't go to a cemetery to visit the dead. They were right there, under the field, next to the barn, sometimes in the barn. And if the livestock suddenly fell ill or the sheep refused to cross a threshold, that was information. One saga recounts a haunting so subtle, no one realized it had started until they looked back. First, the sheep stopped entering the pen. Then, milk went sour. Then someone got sick. Only after a dream did the family realize the root cause: a grandfather buried too shallowly after a storm. They dug up the bones and reburied him properly. Problem solved. That's how people survived here. They interpreted the world around them constantly. If the fog clung too long to the ground, maybe it wasn't just weather. If the wind pushed open the same door each night, maybe it wasn't just faulty hinges. Icelanders didn't just believe in ghosts, they lived with them. The cold wasn't just temperature, it was presence. But let's not romanticize it too much. This wasn't all poetic fog and ghostly silhouettes. Isolation was hard. It broke people. It fed anxiety. It made belief in hauntings less a choice and more of a me-coping mechanism. Some scholars argue that ghost stories helped explain emotional trauma in a culture that didn't have words for it. A child dies unexpectedly. Maybe it was the work of a restless ancestor. A neighbor goes mad during the winter. Perhaps they saw something they weren't meant to see. In a world without modern psychology, the supernatural was how people made sense of suffering. And in the darkest months, skamdegi, the short days of deep winter, people huddled together not just for warmth, but to share stories. Oral sagas were memory blankets passed down to keep identity alive through silence and snow. And ghost stories were some of the warmest of all, because they felt closest to home. You can almost imagine it, can't you? A circle of flickering lamplight, faces lit with orange and shadow as someone clears their throat and begins. So this happened to my grandfather's cousin, back when the snow reached the top of the windows, and everyone leans in already knowing the story, but needing to hear it again. Because repetition wards off fear. And ghosts, well, ghosts hate being known too well. Isolation gave Icelandic ghost stories teeth. It made them sharper, slower, more intimate. You didn't need special effects or dramatic gore. Just one slow knock, one sigh behind a door, one voice whispering your name when everyone else is asleep. So now, as the wind picks up again outside your window and the logs in the fire shift with a low groan, remember this. In medieval Iceland, the ghosts weren't out there. They were right here. You wake in the middle of the night to silence, true, oppressive silence. Not even the wind moves now. Just the creak of the house settling around you and the faint thought that somewhere beneath you, the earth might be turning over its dead. Welcome back to medieval Iceland, where even silence carries a story. Let's talk now about rituals. The ways Icelanders tried to keep their ghosts quiet, or at least well-behaved. Because when the dead refused to stay buried, the living got creative. We've already seen how sagas describe hauntings, like their weather events, inevitable, seasonal, and miserable. But they didn't stop at telling stories. Icelanders developed full-on strategies for handling ghosts. Some involved priests, some involved knives, and some involved, well, things that sound suspiciously like instructions you'd find in a survival horror game. One of the most common remedies was proper burial. You'd think that would be a given, but in a harsh, resource-strapped country where winter could freeze the ground solid, people sometimes had to improvise. And when they did, the consequences were often supernatural. Historians still argue whether the burial rituals described in sagas were literal or exaggerated for dramatic effect. But according to the stories, there was a very particular checklist. Bury the body deep enough. Bury it facing the right direction, usually east. Place a stone over the grave. Do not, under any circumstance, bury someone with unresolved grudges. One saga describes a man so worried his bitter uncle might return from the dead that he buried him with heavy stones over each limb and an iron knife on the chest. When the grave was later disturbed, of course, no one dared touch the body again without a priest present, which brings us to another important ritual, the intervention of clergy. Iceland adopted Christianity around the year 1000, but it did so in a very Icelandic way by blending old beliefs with new. So even though Christianity officially frowned on ghost lore, local priests became the go-to experts for hauntings. In one case, a priest is summoned to banish a ghost that's been knocking on walls and freezing people's livestock. He arrives, sprinkles holy water, and commands the spirit to rest. But when that doesn't work, he spends the night debating theology with the ghost. Apparently, that was a valid exorcism tactic, somewhere between the power of Christ compels you and let's unpack your feelings. Sometimes priests read scripture, sometimes they slept in haunted spaces, and sometimes they just stood by while other people did the dirty work, like digging up a corpse, severing its limbs, and burning them separately. Harsh? Yes. But ghost problems called for ghost solutions. And then there were the binding rituals. These were rooted more in folk magic than official religion. If someone feared that a newly dead person might come back because they'd been angry, greedy, or just generally unpleasant in life, they could perform a series of acts designed to bind the spirit. These included tying the big toes together with twine, sewing the mouth shut with black thread, driving iron nails through the soles of the feet, burying the body with specific stones, known to weigh down a restless spirit. And if someone forgot, that's when things got dramatic. One tale tells of a man named Bjarni, who skipped the binding rites for his uncle, claiming, He never bothered anyone in life. Why should he in death? 3 days later, the uncle was seen walking across a nearby ridge, carrying a sheep under one arm and a lantern in the other. Bjarni never skipped the ritual again. But it wasn't just about the body. The house had to be cleansed too. Fires were lit in every room. Ashes were scattered at thresholds. Sometimes Omahar's soul door. A small opening in the wall was made so the spirit could exit. Once it left, the door was bricked up. If it wasn't, well, good luck sleeping. Even farm animals got involved. It was said that sheep and dogs could see ghosts, and their behavior was watched closely. If a dog barked at an empty corner or sheep refused to enter a barn, people didn't shrug. They lit fires. They summoned priests. They whispered apologies. And here's where things get stranger. The living sometimes caused hauntings by mistake. Speak ill of the dead. They might come knocking. Move a burial marker. Expect company. Even forgetting to commemorate someone's death day could lead to problems. So, Icelanders developed memory rituals. Small rites to keep the peace with the departed. Candles on death anniversaries. Quiet moments at sunset. Whispered prayers when passing a gravesite. Not grand gestures, just enough to say, I haven't forgotten you. Please don't walk through my walls. Ghost stories often included scenes of failed rituals, forgotten prayers, neglected graves, improper burials. And those failures weren't just mistakes. They were plot points. The causes of everything that followed. The world of the living and the dead wasn't separated by a thick wall. It was more like a curtain, and it was your job to keep it closed. So when you think of medieval Icelandic life, don't just picture sheep and snow and sagas. Picture rituals. Tiny acts of spiritual maintenance done again and again to keep the peace. A world where every shadow had a name and every death had a follow-up appointment. And if you're ever tempted to skip one, to say it's probably fine. Just remember that's how half these stories begin. The fire is nearly out now. Just a few glowing embers like tired stars on the edge of sleep. And yet, you stay awake because we've come this far. And what's one more ghost between friends? Tonight we look at legacy. Not of kings or castles, but of stories the ones Icelanders told, preserved, and passed on, even when the snow buried everything else. See, Iceland isn't just known for having ghost stories. It's known for keeping them. And not just in memory, but on vellum in libraries and eventually printed books. That's not common. Many medieval cultures had ghost traditions, but Iceland is one of the few that treated them like a national archive. Why? Partly because Icelanders have always had a fierce devotion to history. When your climate can kill your crops, and your neighbors live 10 fjords away, your stories are your survival. They bind generations. They keep people awake through long winters. They remind communities of who they are and who they were foolish enough to insult. And ghost stories, strangely enough, were reliable. They didn't change much. The dead walked because the living failed them. The wind whispered because someone forgot a name. And justice, if it came from both sides of the grave. Historians still argue whether Iceland's preservation of ghost sagas was driven by cultural pride or just practical storytelling. But either way, the result is stunning, an enormous body of supernatural literature that stretches back centuries, all recorded in deliberate, painstaking detail. Books like Flateyjarbók, Modruvalabók, and Hawksbuck aren't just collections of myths. They're carefully curated manuscripts that include everything from biblical tales to historical chronicles. To that time, a corpse interrupted a dinner party, and Icelanders didn't stop at copying old stories. They added to them, even into the 17th and 18th centuries. Long after most of Europe dismissed ghosts as superstition, Icelanders continued collecting them. Clergymen like John Arnason think of him as the Icelandic Grimm brother, gathered tales from farmers, fishermen, and shepherds. His compilations include stories of spectral dogs, headless travelers, haunted fjords, and mysterious figures who vanish when approached. In one memorable account, a man walking home from a funeral sees his own reflection step out of a pond wave politely and vanish into the mist. He never recovers. No explanation is offered, just a shiver of recognition. And in another, a girl disappears into the mountains during a snowstorm. Months later, she returns different, quiet, her eyes not quite the same. She refuses to sleep near fire, avoids mirrors, and never speaks of where she's been. The villagers say she died and came back. Her family insists she never left. There's no ending, just silence. That's the power of Icelandic ghost stories. They don't end, they just echo, and those echoes still live today. Not just in tourist pamphlets or museum exhibits, but in daily life. Iceland remains one of the few countries where belief in the supernatural isn't relegated to Halloween. Ask around, and you'll find someone with a personal ghost story, maybe about a haunted road, a cursed object, or a noise in the attic that always comes exactly at midnight. Even modern Icelandic laws reflect this. Construction projects have been rerouted to avoid suspected elf stones. Yes, really. And when a road was set to cut through a known ghost site in the 1990s, public outcry delayed the project. People weren't afraid of ghosts in the cinematic sense. They were afraid of the disrespecting memory. That's what these stories do. They demand respect. For the past, for the dead, for the fact that your actions ripple long after you're gone. And maybe that's why these tales were written on Cowhide. Why they were told and retold across centuries. Why they were passed down not as scary stories, but as inheritance. They weren't just meant to be believed. They were meant to be felt. You huddled under wool in a turf house, hearing a knock on the wall that doesn't match the wind. You crossing a ridge at dusk and seeing footprints that don't belong. You remembering your grandmother's story about the girl who slept with her back to the door and what came for her when no one was watching. The ghosts live because we let them. Because somewhere deep down, we know the past isn't done with us. And in Iceland, they never pretended it was. So tonight, as the last embers wink out, you're left with this. There are stories carved in stone, stories whispered through trees, and stories stitched into the very bones of the land. Iceland's ghost stories are all three, and they're still walking. Right behind you, there's a hush now deeper than silence, older than words. The kind of stillness that settles when all the stories have been told, but the meaning lingers like smoke curling in the rafters long after the fire dies. This is where our journey slows, not because the ghosts are gone, but because you've come to understand them. Not as ghouls in the dark, but as memories in motion. You've crossed frozen fjords, cracked open burial mounds, listened to grieving women and restless warriors, and followed monks by candlelight as they inscribed the dead into eternity on cured cowhide. You've seen what it means to carry a secret through snowstorms, how even silence has texture when it's wrapped in fear, and how haunting can be an act of love, of revenge, or of memory refusing to be erased. And now, as you sit in your quiet corner of the world, whatever century, whatever place, you know the truth. Iceland's sagas have whispered for generations. The dead never really leave. And that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes they come to warn you, sometimes to remind you, sometimes to insist that justice be done. But mostly, they come to be remembered. Because to be forgotten in Iceland's long night is to be erased. And the worst fate isn't death, it's silence. So Icelanders wrote, and wrote, and wrote. On skin, on scraps, on anything that could hold a tale. They wrapped ghosts in words and stitched them into time so that centuries later, someone like you might sit in the dim light listening closely and feel the cold breath of memory just behind your ear. The ghosts are still there, in the sagas, in the hills, in the pauses between sentences. And now they live a little in you, because the moment you carry a story forward, even one whispered between yawns. You've done what Icelanders did best. You've given memory a spine. You've made the dead part of the living again. So sleep easy, knowing that the footsteps in your hallway tonight aren't here to frighten you. They're just echoes. Maybe even gratitude. Because you listened. And now, let's slow everything down now. Take a deep breath. Let the air fill your lungs slowly, then ease out like a sigh you've been saving all day. Your shoulders can fall now. Your jaw can unclench. You're safe here. Truly. Outside, the world is still. Maybe the sky is clear. Maybe there's the hush of falling snow. Maybe the wind carries stories you'll never quite understand. But inside, it's warm. It's soft. You are wrapped in memory and story in the long tradition of people who looked into the dark and chose not fear, but imagination. The ghosts have been fed. The past has been seen. And you've walked with kings and peasants, with scribes and spirits, and you've made it to the other side. There's no more to prove tonight. No sagas left to unravel. Just the gentle truth that you made it through the cold, and now you rest. Maybe your dreams will hold fragments of the tale, a snowbound farm, a flickering lantern, the sound of a distant horse's hooves. Or maybe you'll sleep heavy and dreamless, the best kind of sleep, the kind Icelandic winters were made for. Wherever you are, whenever you're listening, thank you for letting these old stories come alive again, for keeping the ghosts company, and for trusting me to walk with you word by word through their long haunted halls. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Maybe by now you've already drifted off to sleep, and if so, we hope this story brought you peace of mind and helped you rest a little easier. Deep sleep makes life better, and we're truly happy to be part of that. Until next time, sweet dreams.